Welcome to the Quillette podcast. And this week I'm going to be talking about an issue that's close to home, which is to say, my Canadian home. As many viewers will know, newly elected US President Donald Trump recently threatened to impose crippling 25% tariffs on exports from my country. Fortunately, Trump relented at the last minute, but the threat isn't gone, as Trump says he will impose the tariffs in a month's time, though whether he makes good on that threat is anybody's guess. This crisis has come at an awkward time for Canada, as our unpopular Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, is on his way out the door, and the question of who will succeed him is still in flux. With me to discuss these developments is my fellow Canadian, Jen Gerson, who's from Alberta and edits the popular news and opinion site The Line, which comes to us via Substack at readtheline.ca. And just to let you know, if you're a regular Quillette podcast listener, you might find this episode a little unusual, as my discussion with Jen is a lot more informal and casual and kibitzey than most of the interviews I do. Partly I think that's because I've known Jen for a long time, as well as her fellow The Line editor, Matt Carney. But to be honest, I think it's also because she's just Canadian, like me. So there's going to be a lot of gossipy Canadian banter and crosstalk that you're going to hear. I tried to avoid it, but, things happen. As you'll hear, Jen and I are both conscious of the fact that all this inside baseball, Canadian tariffs, and politics stuff might not be of maximum interest to our non-Canadian listeners, and I promise not to make a habit of it. In any case, I invite my Canadian and non-Canadian listeners alike to enjoy my interview with The Line editor, Jen Gerson. Jen, thanks so much for being on the Quillette podcast to talk about tariffs. You said something very intriguing to me when I first raised the subject of tariffs with you by email. I think you said, by the way, John, I think Trump is giving Canada a head fake. And I wasn't sure what you meant. What did you mean by that?
Well, to sum up just sort of the craziness that's happened in the last week or two, we've had Trump take Canada and Mexico right to the brink of a potentially catastrophic
Sure.
trade war for Canada with very serious economic consequences. And only hours before that trade war was supposed to come into effect, and a 25% tariff was supposed to be levied on all Canadian goods, 10% on Canadian oil, and of course, Canada was planning a series of retaliatory countermeasures in place. Looks like Trump and Trudeau have a phone call in the morning of that very day. Afterwards, we've got Trump having a public appearance, basically saying, "Well, Canada doesn't treat us very well." I believe he named a bunch of specific grievances he had with Canada that hadn't come up previously and had nothing to do with fentanyl or
Right.
the border. And then I believe he made a reference to the idea of Canada becoming a 51st state if we
Right.
didn't like it. And then he said, "Well, yeah, but I've got another phone call with Justin Trudeau happening later today." 3 o'clock Eastern time. He has a second phone call with Justin Trudeau. Apparently, they hammer out some kind of agreement, which was a bunch of border measures and border spending, in addition to the announcement of a fentanyl czar.
Right.
And after that, Trump says, "Well, I'll give you a 30-day reprieve from the tariffs." And why I think that was a head fake was twofold. One is, what did we do? What did we give him to get that 30-day reprieve? And
A
what was like
fentanyl czar.
a fentanyl czar? I
Whatever
mean,
that
for
is. Yeah,
for
whatever
for
that
for
is.
for people who are in America, I mean, I think the idea of naming a czar, right, to deal with a specific problem is a very American
It's a
thing.
weird thing. Like, I don't think we've
Like,
ever had a czar. And by the way, the
no,
word czar, of course, is even in the United States is used metaphorically because, of course, the
that's
last
right.
czar of Russia stepped down
Yes.
about a century ago.
In
But
Canada, we try to resolve our problems by appointing a Supreme Court justice to study the issue for several
right,
months, and
or
then issue
commissions
and
that
then
kind of,
commission
yeah,
that
yeah,
that that issue a report
yeah,
with a bunch of recommendations that just
yeah,
so happen to perfectly align with
right.
the liberal partisan agenda. But that's a whole other conversation. So I mean, this is not in alignment with Canadian norms.
It's not part of the political
I-
idiom in Canada, let us
Exactly,
say.
that's
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
And it's to deal with a problem that I think frankly is mostly manufactured, not totally manufactured. I mean, obviously we in Canada need to be taking fentanyl seriously. It kills Americans and Canadians in copious amounts, and I don't think that, you're not going to hear any complaint from me about taking fentanyl seriously. Um, but it was a weird symbolic thing to add to a bunch of things that we had already announced we were going to do in order to address Trump's border and drug concerns. And of course, then the real head fake problem is like, okay, well, that buys us a reprieve of 30 days. So we start this weird reality show cycle potentially up again in 3 weeks.
right.
And we've already demonstrated to Trump that he can gain some kind of at least symbolic concession by picking on us this way. So why would he conveniently ignore that 30-day deadline a month from now? I would also point out that that means that this tariff reprieve is going to come to an end before, well, let me do the math on that, just before, I believe, the Liberals are about to announce their new leader, then
Right.
Justin Trudeau's replacement as Prime Minister, and then just before we go into
Okay,
an election.
let's leave that
All
subplot
right.
to later
Subplot.
in the show.
There's
Yeah,
there's it's a nesting subplot here. It's
right.
kind of
But
like we're kind of like season 5 of Wired or Sopranos or something like
right,
this. You kind of have to be following it. But um, the reason why I think it's a head fake is because Canadians were, as the tariffs were about to be announced, I thought that Canadians were starting to gain a real resolve
right.
around what was about to happen. There was a weird psychological kind of rally around the flag effect that was starting to form and take effect. People were passing around Buy Canadian memes. There was traffic surging to Canadian websites to help Canadians make more informed
Which is
buying
weird because we're
decisions.
such a free trading country that it never kind of occurs to me to buy Canadian when it comes to, I don't know, computers or, I mean, I guess if I'm looking for softwood lumber or, I don't know, like wheat and barley products, I probably can find Canadian stuff. But it's like we had to borrow this whole patriotic language kind of from other societies. Like it doesn't really fall naturally from our lips, does it?
No, it didn't. But also, I think that there was a real and sincere anger and sense of betrayal about the fact that America was seriously considering
Right.
doing this. I
Yeah.
mean, the American anthem was booed at 2 hockey games up here. I mean,
Which
that's
I object
that's
to. I think that I can see why people did it, but I leave the hockey out of it, right?
leave. I mean, the hockey is
Yeah.
sacrosanct. That should be
Yeah.
a place where we can
And
all
plus
come
half the
together.
American players are from Canada anyway, so
Well, don't tell Americans that; they'll
right.
start
Yeah.
tariffing them. Um,
That's a good point. Yeah.
the point being in all of this is that there was a real sentiment among Canadians that really a relationship that we had relied on and built our entire economy and lives around trusting has fundamentally proved itself to be unreliable, and that was leading to a real sense of resolve and anger. I
Right.
think among a lot of Canadians, even a lot of Canadians who are really starting to pay attention to the risks here. And when Trump announced the 30-day reprieve, my fear is that a lot of Canadians who had otherwise was starting to get themselves ginned up to make some real and necessary systemic changes to the way this country operates, suddenly went, "Oh, thank God! Of course he's bluffing. Cool. We'll give him a fentanyl czar
But
and some border money,
yeah.
and then nothing. We don't have to really change anything, and everything will be fine because he doesn't actually mean it. He's just being Trump. We can just ignore this." Um,
But that's not a crazy thing to think for two reasons. First of all, this is the second time we've been through this. When Trump first became president, this is the 2016 election, he threatened to rip up NAFTA. I thought at the time Justin Trudeau dealt with that situation fairly deftly, and there was some minor changes to the free trade agreement. NAFTA, of course, being the free trade agreement that governs Canada, Mexico, and the United States, and that was that. And then Trump shifted to other fixations. Is it is it unrealistic to think that Trump, who's already he's starting, he's talking about moving 2 million Gazan Palestinians to other countries and
yeah,
taking over
that'll occupy his time.
Greenland. He wants the Panama Canal. Like he does have a sort of like I don't want to call it childish because I don't want all our Trump fans to turn off this podcast at the same time. Call it a childlike um, propensity to just kind of shift his attention radically. he fires off some tweets, and then, I mean, geopolitically, he seems to have ADHD.
Hmm.
Like the stuff he's talking about with Gaza is is pretty off the wall. But at the same time, as a Canadian, I'm like, well, if that occupies him for the next couple of months, at least he won't be talking about tariffs,
We'll
right?
be talking about it. So I would say there's 2 points to that, and that is Canada's best hope for getting out of a second Trump presidency and relatively unscathed is exactly that.
Right.
He just gets distracted. He starts bombing a Mexican cartel. He starts, bulldozing the Gaza Strip. He starts doing God knows what. I mean, who knows what he'll announce
And
next
we do,
week.
by the way, we don't want those things to happen. We're not like, oh,
Right.
please
No.
go destroy other societies so
Yes.
ours
So
will remain.
ours are,
Yeah,
but,
we're not
you
advocate
know,
we're not advocating that.
we're
Right.
not really advocating
Right.
that, but honestly, if we're being ruthlessly strategic here, and taking, the reality of human
Oh my
lives and equations
God.
out of the equation
Who is this
here.
monster I've invited on the podcast?
Yeah, people think
Uh,
people think Canadians are nice. We're not nice.
I would like to
I keep on saying
disassociate
I keep on
myself.
saying no, John. So you have to understand, Canadians, or what your audience has to understand, is that Canadians are polite. We're not nice.
Right.
Um, so you're starting to see a little of the true
We're a
colors
little
come
bit
out.
nice. I'm sorry. You know what?
Well, speak for yourself.
I like Canadians just fine. Look, so
So
obviously
yes, I think
we're
that that's
joking
right.
around
Our
here. Yeah.
best hope is that he gets distracted with other priorities and more or less forgets that we exist, and we manage to stay under the cover and
Right.
get ignored. However, there's two things that I would respond to with that, and one is, if that happens and we miss the opportunity that Trump is giving us to make the necessary changes that we need to make in our economy and society, that would be a real
Giving
crime.
Trump the opportunity that Trump is giving us, this sounds a lot like thank you,
Well,
sir,
in the
may I have
sense, no,
another? Like,
in the sense that all crises are opportunities,
all right. Okay, so tell okay, look, there's some
right?
things that we agree is kind of crazy, like I don't know, becoming the 51st state, that's not gonna happen. But like so the fentanyl thing.
Well, but wait. Let's come back to that.
Okay.
Because the other thing that I would say as well is, even Canada can't build a strategy for the next 4 to 10 to even 20 years around trying to guess when Donald Trump is serious, because that's a mug's game. I
So,
don't
okay,
know
when you,
whether or
by the way,
not
when you
he's
say 20
serious.
years, you don't
Well,
mean Trump's there for 20. You mean like his successor may be
his
Trump-like. Yeah,
successor. Look,
yeah, right.
all of the forces that led to Trump's ascendancy
Sure.
are still going to be present in American society. We're still present in American society when Trump left office. I mean, I remember writing that column in 2018,
Barack Obama's
2019.
not coming back.
Yeah,
It's yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
Like
right.
the world order is fundamentally
Sure.
changing, and Trump one was our first red flag that that was happening, and we completely ignored it and failed to make any kind of internal strategic changes to prepare for that as a country. And all of those ascendancies and those currents will still
But
be in play
okay,
after
but
Trump
in
leaves
terms of
office.
Canada prepping for that, I mean, so some things seem more symbolic and kind of like are obviously just sops to Trump, like this fentanyl czar thing. And I think
Sure.
uh, Trudeau, he had to put I think Mexican drug lords on our terrorism list. So now,
Yeah.
like I mean, they're terrible people. They sell drugs and kill people.
I mean, I'm not arguing for the cartels. I'm not going to
But
make
okay,
that. I'm
but
contrarian, but I'm not that contrarian.
putting that stuff aside, like the sort of short-term sops to Trump, tell me some of the things that Trump was pushing for that really would be in our best interests uh, to make serious policy changes.
I mean, the first one that I would bring to the top of the table, and the one that I think is really interesting that Trump hasn't prioritized, is our NATO spending.
Right?
We have no leg to stand on
Oh,
when
he's
Trump.
talked about in general,
Yeah,
other
but
countries.
it's
Like, yeah,
real no, but it's really interesting to me that he's built the whole moral rationale for this tariff war around these kind of manufactured concerns around fentanyl and border migrant crossings around, with Canada, and has really underplayed the place where we are morally not defensible, and
can I
that's our
just
NATO
jump in?
spending.
Just
Yeah.
jump in because I think it was the New York Times that had a very interesting graph. Defense spending as a percentage of GDP. And
Hmm.
if you looked, it wasn't just NATO countries. It was is basically, I think, like Western countries, OECD nations, dozens of countries were listed. In terms of defense spending as a percentage of GDP, Canada was at the bottom, along with, if memory serves, Luxembourg, Slovenia, and maybe it was Spain. If that's, I'm sorry to the Spanish if I got that wrong, but pretty much near the bottom of the barrel. I think less than 1% of GDP on defense. 2% is seen as sort of like the minimum responsible number, and
2% is what we've agreed to.
right,
Like
and we're nowhere
it's
near
not.
that. We're
Yeah,
nowhere near
no,
that.
I think
Yeah.
we're 1.5 or something
Okay.
of that to that nature. But I would want to double check. But I mean, the 2% I mean, people will say, well, 2% is an arbitrary number. No, it's the number. It's the arbitrary number we agreed to spend,
Okay.
and haven't for decades, and haven't for generations. And I think that where I get really pissed off about the NATO spending personally as a Canadian is that Canadians have a tendency to be extremely smug and
Mm.
smarmy with Americans, especially where it comes to the entitlements that we have purchased for ourselves, the healthcare entitlements. I mean, Justin Trudeau a couple of weeks ago, I believe, went on CNN, Jake Tapper's show, and started talking about the just and compassionate society that Canadians have built, as proven by his dental program and his national
Ugh.
child care program and all these really picayune entitlements. And of course, the CNN host, because he regarding Canadian leaders as not real people, didn't actually give him a bunch of hard questions. And one of the things that I think Canadians need to get their heads around is the reason why we can afford those entitlements is because we rely on America. We just know America will come and defend us if need be. So we direct and prioritize entitlement spending with the knowledge that if need be, Americans who don't have access to a fraction of our entitlements can be expected to bleed and die for us.
Sidebar, this thing.
And I think that that's a morally indefensible position that we've staked out for ourselves. And if Trump were to make an argument for a protectorate tax or even tariffs around that argument, I think that he would have a strong moral case to be made that
So you're on Trump's side. You just think he picked the wrong arguments
no, I think it's interesting that he picked the arguments that he did. Well, no, I'm not
because
on, no, I'm not on Trump's side. I don't think the tariffs are
yeah,
justified. I don't think they're
right.
economically justified. I don't think this is correct. I'm saying that I'm wondering why he built his moral arguments. I think, let's put it this way. I think Donald Trump is arguing for tariffs for his own domestic reasons. I don't
Sure.
think that they're in response to anything Canada has done or not done. I think he's arguing he wants tariffs because he sees tariffs as being a fundamentally better way to fund the American government. He's using tariffs as a means of changing up his.
He's a protectionist,
He's a
but
protectionist in working.
but
I don't
also
think.
the drug
I think the rest of it is all bullshit.
the
But
drug thing and the migrant thing, the crime thing, resonates more with the average American than some baseline like, oh, they're supposed to spend 2% of GDP, they're only spending 1.5 on military stuff. Like the crime and migrant stuff, the stuff he's emphasized has more of a visceral appeal to his base, I
even
guess.
yeah, even if it's not fact based. I mean,
Right.
the other conspiratorial argument is that he doesn't actually want us to incentivize or spend that money on military spending. He'd rather us spend it on stuff that's frankly symbolic and useless and have us fritter away our resources because it benefits America to not have Canada be strong on defense.
I don't know about that, but going back to that CNN thing, I have noticed that when American journalists interview Canadians, yeah, they don't ask hard questions, but it's kind of like they're interviewing like,
Pets?
well, the leader of a community group or something.
Yeah.
Like, we're now going to talk to the leader
Oh,
of the local
so
Lutonian
cute.
Association about
Yeah.
the statue they're putting up to their Lutonian leader. Like, there is kind of like they were probably handed, a half-page fact sheet of, what do Canadians
Canada is a
like? Where's
country
Canada? You're
in the
right. It's its
north.
own country. It has its own currency and passports
It's
and stuff and
different
stamps.
laws.
Yeah.
Your friends probably drank there when they were
Right.
19.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, I think there's a funny thing that, and we're so exposed to American media. It's so interesting to watch how Canada is treated and perceived, thrown back at us all the time, right? And what I think is really interesting, because on left-wing Canadian media, there's an assumption that Canada is kind of this sweet little utopian socialist
We're like the
paradise where
Netherlands. We're
we're
like the
like the
Netherlands.
Netherlands.
Yeah.
It's so
Right.
adorable,
With skiing.
and totally, and a subsequent unwillingness to acknowledge that the entitlements that we've purchased for ourselves and the kind of culture we purchased ourselves also included some significant trade-offs, and an unwillingness to address problems like NATO spending. And then on the right, you hear this kind of caricature of Canada,
Right.
where we're a woke hellscape where all freedom of speech has been totally diminished and crushed. I mean, John, I hope that you have your doors reinforced for when the Canadian anti-speech SWAT team smashes it down and muzzles you. But
Okay. That's not going to happen, but it is annoying. Like it's true that we
it's,
don't live in a totalitarian state, but it can be very kvetchy here when it
I
comes
mean,
to, yeah, the
I, I,
anti-hate
I
stuff.
I've written about the anti-hate stuff and a lot of the legislation that the Liberals have proposed in highly critical terms, and I've testified at now several committees about some of the
Right.
stuff they've passed. So you're not going to see me be an apologist for this particular government's approach to protecting
Right.
culture and trying to police speech. I can give you a very detailed analysis of everything I find wrong with it. But when I listen to like the version of
Yeah.
Canada that I hear on Joe Rogan, that's not the version of Canada that I'm criticizing.
In fairness, that's also the dystopian hellscape language they use to describe like colleges and universities
Sure.
and the EU and like New York City and like Portland. Actually, Portland it
Well,
kind of is.
Portland, no, we're gonna
Yeah,
do in
it's
Portland.
sorry, that's a bad example because it is a garbage can. But actually, one thing, this is a tangent. When we talk about American stereotypes of Canada, and just reassuring our listeners, this isn't just going to be two Canadians just having a bitch fest about how Americans don't appreciate us. Um,
But they don't, and we
they
feel sad
don't.
about it.
They,
Could you be
but
nicer, please?
anybody listening, and Jen, I don't know if that includes you, who's seen the show How I Met Your Mother, the depiction of Canada, because one of the main characters in How I Met Your Mother is a Canadian. It's like the central female love interest, and she lives in New York, and she drinks at a bar called the Hoser Hut, and she's like always babbling about hockey. And occasionally the characters actually visit Canada, and all the scenes take place in a Tim Hortons, and every character is like a 1975 stereotype from, the Great White North. So, but I promised my listeners that I would not make this podcast about that. Tariffs are a very serious economic issue, so we're going to get back to that.
I mean, we
Um,
can we can we can have a couple of jokes though, because
yeah, but I
it
knew
is
that.
really funny.
But it was weird. Had we been doing this podcast 3 or 4 days ago, before Trump said, "Oh well, you've got for some unknown reason, you've got this 30-day grace period," while I think of new new tap
No,
dances I want
well,
Justin Trudeau to do.
while I get a rose to decide which of the Bachelor contestants will get voted
That's a bet,
off
right?
in
So that's
round.
a second TV
Yeah,
illusion to delight our audience. But had we been having this conversation like just a couple of days ago, when it really looked, I mean, these tariffs were set, I think it's February 2nd, if I remember correctly. We'd be having a very different kind of conversation. Now we're kind of laughing about it, but a month from now we may not be. Like it's kind of humiliating, and not just for Canada, Mexico, I think Colombia. Like Trump is just reciting these kind of arbitrary demands, and these leaders from other countries are doing them. Like it's. I mean, it's to me, it's embarrassing for Trump that he's doing it. He's like a child, but it's also embarrassing for these other countries, including Canada. No,
but he can also parlay any concession is into a win in his info space.
right, right,
Right. Which so it doesn't even matter whether or not it was a win or a not win. I mean, to some extent, if we can manage to manage Trump purely through kabuki theater, that is actually a win for us. That means is that we have to go onto Fox News and seem really pained and compliant. You know what I mean? Like our leaders just have to really work
right,
at this a little bit harder and not be like, well, we really want. No, they need to go onto Fox News or the equivalent
right,
and just say, man, that Donald Trump, he's a tough negotiator, but he's fair. And
right.
I then you know what I mean? Like we have to play the game.
But just as you
Um,
say it, it's so cringy. Like
I
I mean,
understand, but this
don't.
is as Matt and I like to repeat to ourselves, America has the right to choose its own destiny. And this is the destiny they've chosen, therefore locking us all into this darkest of dark timelines. So this is just the
That is how
reality
Matt talks. That is how Matt talks.
we we really just have to embrace it and roll
Yeah.
forward. But the other thing that I would say is we can't build our own as Canadians, we can't build our own economic and military strategies around the idea that Trump's next move can be guessed.
Right.
We have to build our strategies and our plans around the worst case scenario.
But okay, but let me ask you about that specifically because there's been some you see pie in the sky op-eds and stuff on social media by people who should know better saying, well, like if Trump wants to be like this, screw him. We're going to make Europe our biggest trading partner. Like as if this is just a button we can push and say, oh,
No,
instead of all these bulk commodities being
no,
sent by rail to the United States, we'll just put them in like I don't know the luggage compartment of a jet and send them to China or whatever. We can't really do that. Like
no, we have to start thinking in generational terms, and we're going to have to make some generational readjustments, and it's going to be painful. but we have to
What
do
does
it
that mean?
because
I like that.
it means that, for example, we're going to have to build the pipelines that we've
Right.
spent 15 years fighting about in order to help diversify
Okay, we have
our
to
oil
stop
exports.
just for a sec because it is an important subject. So I'm just going to,
Okay.
in Canada, the pipeline issue, we have a ton of oil. Moving it is a problem because a lot of the pipeline construction stuff gets mired in arguments between the provinces and the federal government because there's overlapping jurisdictions. And right now,
Well, no,
too much
that's not
information.
true. No,
Well,
sorry.
well, I
I'm
mean,
not.
Quebec has something to say about it because Quebec is blocking
No,
the
it's
pipe,
it's not overlapping. It's not overlapping jurisdictions. The federal government has the right to set the regulatory terms by which
and yet
pipelines are.
Quebec is
That's
blocking
but
Western
not
oil
because
from.
it has the not because it has the legal right,
Okay,
because it has the ability to influence the politics. And what I think is really interesting is, as a result of what's happening with Trump, we're seeing an absolute sea change about how those politics play out.
but not in
I
Quebec
think
though. I mean,
no,
like,
Francois Legault was today
okay.
basically talking about the importance of pipelines. So, which was unthinkable to have happened
So
domestically
you think this
even
may
2 or 3
happen?
years
We
ago.
may
Well, we
actually.
have to. We have
Okay.
to. And we have to also stop thinking about. I mean, we in Canada also have a tendency to be, how should I say this, overly stingy in
Hmm.
terms of how we allocate resources. I mean, you can draw an analogy to healthcare, for example. We will build just enough, and then a penny over just enough is too much, right? I mean, we have built just enough pipeline infrastructure in order to, broadly speaking, sell exactly as much oil as we create at a discount to the American market. But
Right.
anything more than that is too much. We've just got to get that out of our head. We have to understand that building pipelines, even if they aren't, how should I say that, even if they aren't necessarily in the best business case scenario, is in the strategic national interest. And if you're interested in preserving Canada as a confederation, as a nation, sometimes there are going to be certain areas in which we have to put strategic interest above marginal material interest.
So
Liquid natural gas would be
another
another obvious
subplot that
topic there.
I'm duty bound as a Canadian podcaster to mention in this context is even saying the words is boring, but it's important. Interprovincial trade barriers.
Oh
And
God, I
yeah,
know Americans are
I know,
just
God,
just locking
it's
in.
okay.
All right,
However, stay with me, folks. It
it's
is
fascinating.
it is harder, it is often harder to sell goods from one province in another province, particularly things like booze, than it is to export it to the United States. And that part is an absolutely archaic system. And we have a lot of archaic stuff. Like our dairy,
Dairy,
we have this
free
ancient
the cheese.
socialist, it's what we call it supply management, which is a complete euphemism. It's essentially a government controlled quota system like the kind that they used to have, in the 1930s, in other countries. And we still have it. It's amazing to me. People forget that in 2016, Donald Trump, on behalf of Wisconsin dairy farmers, was railing against Canada's dairy supply management system and claiming it was completely unfair, which it is. It's a
It is.
complete racket. How come he's not talking about that anymore? See, this is one of the reasons I think it's impossible
This
to
is
predict him. Even when Trump has a good card to play, which is, I mean, it's a
NATO
boring card.
spending and cheese.
Yeah, cheese, supply management, interprovincial trade. These are all real things, but he'd rather talk about this BS like fentanyl tsunami, which, by the way, American sources say that I think like maybe 1% of America's fentanyl comes from Canadian smugglers.
I think actually Canada's fentanyl supply. We get more fentanyl from the U.S. than we
So
than
we're running a
comes from.
fentanyl surplus
Yeah, I
from,
think
yeah.
I actually think the numbers that I saw is that we're running a fentanyl
So it's a
surplus with the
completely,
U.S.
look, fentanyl itself is a tragedy and a horrible problem.
Yeah.
What Trump is making of it is a farce, and yet there's all these legitimate grievances he has, which he's not talking about. So
Oh,
it
and legitimate grievances where he could get people, like a lot of Canadians, on board.
big
Like,
cheese,
I'm
yeah,
sorry, do you think I like the cheese selection at my local co-op? I do not.
it's a travesty. Yeah.
It's I'm sorry, the butter is solid at room temperature, John. You can't spread room
Oh my
temperature
God,
bread on toast in this goddamn
this
country.
this podcast was such a
This
mistake. This was
this
a terrible mistake. Uh,
this is the dystopian hellhole that I want Joe Rogan talking about,
oh my
okay?
God, yeah.
I want good butter.
when
I
I
don't
told
think
my
it's too much to ask.
when I told my boss I was doing a podcast on tariffs, she thought it was a fantastic idea. Little did she know that it would degenerate into complaints about the dairy section at the local Safeway. No, but okay, but like we're joking, but there are all these
But like in a
archaic.
Russian way. We're joking in a Russian way, in a dark,
Well,
dark
Canada
way.
has all these archaic institutions, and if I'm interpreting your broader point correctly, you're saying that as specious as a lot of Trump's complaints are, at least we're getting the good kick in the pants we need to bring our economy out of the 1970s. Is that kind
Yeah,
of
that would be my point, is that I think that we should not let this crisis go to waste. I think that we should start looking at how do we make Canada a radically more economically
okay?
resilient country. We
With a
have
bigger
to get to
military,
with
with a
the
bigger
well,
military.
because that's just necessary in order to I mean, the other interesting thing that I've noticed as a Canadian is that Trump is making all these threats to our sovereignty. Have you noticed the absolute deafening silence from our supposed allies internationally? No one's
Well, I mean,
saying
in
boo.
fairness, they got a lot of stuff to deal with. I mean, Greenland is on the
Yeah,
table. The
absolutely.
Panama Canal. Apparently, they got 2 million Gazans they got to find homes for. I mean, by the way,
Yeah,
Denmark.
that and we've
In
been
fairness,
useless allies.
Denmark, which is a bona fide European country, Denmark was having trouble getting European countries to listen to their complaints
Yeah,
about
well, and
Greenland. So
but
it isn't
also
just Canada.
it
It's
isn't
all,
just Canada,
yeah.
but also like Canada's been a pretty useless ally, bluntly, over the last 10 years. Like
Well,
we've not been
this is
we
harsh, Jen.
we've been real good at lecturing other people about the way that they needed to be in the world, and real bad about actually meeting our most basic commitments and showing up in the way that was meaningful or useful.
All right. Well,
Um,
you're gonna get sound bitten on Fox with talk like this. I mean,
Jesus.
you're giving comfort to our enemies. Speaking of which,
No, no,
uh,
no, no. I'm not giving comfort to Alex, because ultimately what I'm arguing for isn't that Trump's right. What I'm arguing for is that we need to use Trump as an excuse to be a grown-up country and
okay,
to
fair.
start and to start making smart strategic decisions, making ourselves radically more economically resilient so that we can be put in a position where we don't care what Trump does.
Fair,
That's
fair.
the position, or the future Trump, or Donald, or Trump two, or Vance, or whatever future populist wingnut
Okay.
the Americans choose to elect because they have the right to decide their own destiny. We have to make sure that we as a country are, for example, we have the sort of psychological, economic, and psychological and economic resilience to not care. And
Okay, yeah,
right now we don't, and
that was
that's
the
a
kind
problem.
of pithy, telegenic flourish that I was looking for, Jen. So thank
There
you.
we go. That's what
When I
I'm here for.
when
That's
I
not the
booked
part
you,
they're going to clip on me, though.
no,
That's
I can clip anything I want. I'm my own producer. So not Fox, but on our YouTube channel, which gets good traffic. I want to ask you. I was trying to segue gracefully to this topic. Instead, I'll segue awkwardly to it, which is you were talking about traders and Team Canada. This whole tariff controversy has taken place at a very weird time in Canadian politics, and this is what I'm about to say is well known to Canadians, but I'm going to educate international listeners about it, like the 17 who are still listening, which is that Justin Trudeau, he's been in power for about a decade. His left of center Liberal Party, he and his Liberals languishing in the polls, fairly unpopular. Trudeau reluctantly announced his resignation a couple of weeks ago. Everyone thought, okay, he'll just like glide out of political history. In a couple of months, we'll have an election. The Liberals will elect a new leader. And so we've got this situation where suddenly, just in the denouement of Trudeau's leadership, he's been handed this crisis. And you also have all these liberal leadership aspirants who are also like being asked their opinion about the crisis because they, you know,
going to be prime minister in like 30 days. Yeah.
yeah. So you've got this weird situation. And then you've also, to be fair, have a very difficult situation for the capital C conservatives. Our small c conservatives are called large C conservatives. It's roughly the equivalent of the Republicans, except they're not nearly as right wing. But it's difficult for them. Their leader, who's the opposition leader, his name is Pierre Poilievre. He's been getting some international press, so some people outside of Canada may have heard of him. He has a fine line to walk because, as with any international crisis, whenever you're the domestic opposition leader, you have to sort of gauge how far you're going to push your domestic opposition and risk being seen as giving comfort to the enemy and so forth. But at the same time, he does have a few Trump fans. Among Canadian conservatives, there's been a growing Trump phenomenon. It's still very much a minority phenomenon in Canada, but you do have some Trump supporters, and Poilievre doesn't want to alienate them. Could you talk a little bit about this weird political dynamic that's developed? Because it's not really clear cut who's going to profit politically from this, which, I mean, we shouldn't be talking about it, but of course, everyone talks about
Well,
politics, so we are
you
talking
know,
about it.
there are many people, and myself among them, who have heavily criticized Justin Trudeau for leaving when and where he did,
Right,
simply because, for the last year and a half, it's been extremely obvious that the polls had reached a state of terminal decline for him.
right,
And for the good of his party and for his own legacy, he really had a couple of off ramps where he could have left with grace and left his party with enough time to credibly replace him.
right.
And rather than leave in any of those opportunities, he put it off so long that now his party is having to run an extremely truncated race to replace him in the midst of all this goddamn chaos.
It's like a 10-week race or something, right? It's
Yeah, their own constitution requires that it be a 90-day race,
right.
and Trudeau resigned with the period from which he resigned, which I believe off the top of my head was January 6th, to the period at which the current Canadian Parliament runs out of money, so runs out of supply, and therefore has to sit and has to pass a confidence motion, is roughly 77 days.
Oh, by the way, subplot, Parliament is not sitting right now
Yeah,
because it was suspended or
because yeah,
prorogued if you're
it's
from the
great.
17th
Be,
century.
and
So it's been,
it was also extremely inconvenient of Donald Trump to lay this trade war in the midst of a prorogued parliament in which the Liberals had to
but
sort
there's
out their own
also
new
this
leader.
subplot to a subplot, which is where the opposition politicians are rightly demanding that Parliament be recalled so they can address this existential threat. But for partisan political reasons, Trudeau likes it with Parliament not sitting because then no one can criticize him.
Well, and then
Yeah,
also the second parliament comes back, there will be a confidence motion that
yeah.
the Liberals will fail and
This
they'll
is a
go right
minor. I
into an
haven't mentioned
election.
it. We haven't
Yeah.
mentioned it in the discussion. I mentioned it in the introduction. Um, Justin Trudeau's government, as his last government was, is a minority government, meaning that if all the opposition parties gang up, they can topple him instantly. Which
Do we need to have like a Canada Canadian Parliament civics lesson 101, or is that just no?
I'm just proud that I pronounced prorogued properly.
Yeah.
It's
I usually
it's.
say Polyev though, so I mean, there you go.
Oh, I say Poilievre because I'm from
But
Quebec and
yeah, but I'm a trashy Albertan, but then so's
I'm
the Polyev,
very
so
I'm very European.
there you go.
Uh,
Um,
So who's gonna like I
okay,
hate to
so
make this a
like
horse race, but who like
well, okay, but
what is
here's
the
the problem.
political
The Liberals own that chaos.
okay.
They have plunged the chaos the country into a sort of
Is
weird
that
limb.
fair though? I mean the
Yeah,
Trudeau no, so
yeah,
Trump
it is.
owns this chaos. Like if
Well,
somebody from outside your
yeah,
borders makes
okay,
an
but okay,
unprovoked economic attack on your country, how is that like I've criticized Trudeau
yes,
probably as much or more as you, but how is this his fault?
but knowing that that chaos was coming, he didn't resign in November.
Right.
He didn't resign in October. He didn't resign in December. He didn't even resign after his deputy prime minister and sort of his number two in his cabinet, Chrystia Freeland, quit.
Right.
If he had resigned that week, the party still would have had enough time to hold a full leadership race,
Right.
right? Like he waited. He went on a ski vacation, John. Got to get that ski vacation in,
Yeah. Well, I mean he's
and
had a
then
few
came back,
infamous vacations, yeah.
and then only when the opposition party, the Conservatives, said we're going to pass a non-confidence motion in a finance committee, I believe a finance committee meeting, which was slated to come back January 7th, which was a couple weeks ahead of when Parliament was slated to come back. That was what forced his hand into proroguing the Parliament, because if Parliament was allowed to sit January 27th, the Parliament would have fallen on a confidence motion on that point. Odds are, I mean, who knows, but odds are. So instead of facing the music, when what he should have done here is that he should have just let Parliament fall, faced the music, and gone
Yeah.
to an election.
Yeah.
That would have been, at that point, having put off the decision to quit as long as he did, the responsible thing for him to have done would have been to
But
allow Parliament
don't
to
you
fall, face
think
an election, and then win or lose.
don't you think, which is podcaster talk for here's what I think,
Hmm.
don't you think that like the fact that chaos was about to ensue was a feature, not a bug for Trudeau, because he thought the one thing that could save my flailing prime ministerial tenure is for this there to be this outside threat, which I bravely confront, and the entire country rallies behind my courageous leadership.
I think that in their Delulu land
But
internal
it's
pol
not entirely Lulu. Like, haven't their polls of the liberal polls have ticked up lately, right? Like, it's, I mean,
yeah, but that's
there's,
because he quit.
oh,
That's
yeah.
because Trudeau quit. like,
Okay,
whatever
fair
bump
point.
that the liberals
All right.
are proposing, and I'll quote my own husband here, who works in politics and polling, is that you can usually attribute sort of a 5 to 7 point up or down on the popularity of the leader of a party.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, now that doesn't fix for the liberals the fact that they're 20 points back and have been for more than a year. Come on, guys. But
Yeah.
yes, of course it's very predictable to see a 5 to 7 point bump in the polls when a very unpopular leader who's been ahead of the country for what 10 years now and is extremely stale decides that he's going to quit. So that's not unusual. But the fact that we are in this weird limbo state where we have a limited capacity to even respond to Trump's tariff war, because of course I believe you can put a counter tariff on American goods through orders in council, for example, through what the equivalent of an executive order. But you can't fund or supply any kind of economic response because supply agreements or any kind of funding has to go through Parliament. So, like the fact that we could issue a tariff, but we couldn't actually immediately move forward to respond by turning on the taps for Canadian businesses that were affected by that tariff. That's a direct response of his choice to prorogue,
Okay.
right? So it was a totally knowing that tariffs were a high probability when he quit. It was totally irresponsible for him to quit when he did, throw his own internal party and government into chaos, stall out the functions of most of the functions of the Canadian government, as opposed to just go to the polls. I mean,
All
in
right.
Canada, we have like 6 week writ periods, which means if he had just come forward after his ski vacation, if Trudeau just like finished, hitting the slopes, it's like I feel invigorated, come back and drop the writ in January, we'd be 2 weeks away from an election right now.
In fairness, I heard the powder was pretty good at a lot of the Western ski hills this season.
Well, I mean, it's been beautiful
And
and
by the way,
weather's been
this is
gorgeous.
not even the most infamous vacation that Trudeau took, because do you remember when he created
Yes.
this new Canadian holiday called like
Yes.
Genocide Indigenous Reconciliation Day or
Yeah.
whatever, and we all
Yeah.
had to wear orange shirts? And the
Uh-huh.
very first Genocide Reconciliation Indigenous Day or whatever it was called, we were all wearing our orange shirts, doing our land acknowledgements, and he went to the
He went
beach
to
at
Tofino. He
Tofino
was
to surf
surfing.
like a dick. Do you remember that?
Yeah, dude.
Of
That,
course you
but no,
remember it. Yeah,
no,
yeah.
but John, that's not even his most
I think it
notorious
is.
holiday. Remember the Aga Khan holiday?
Oh God. Well, that was a money thing. Because by the way, just by the way,
Oh,
R.I.P.
he's
The
the.
Aga Khan has departed
Oh, sorry.
the
Yes.
human veil. So we have to introduce a somber note. This was just announced yesterday. But yes, no no shade on the Aga Khan. The Aga Khan, among his earthly trappings, goes on a lot of nice vacations, and on one of them he took Justin, and I forget the details, but it was pretty
Okay,
bad.
yeah. So I don't think he necessarily took Justin, but essentially Justin and family got access to the Aga Khan's like private.
He didn't get to meet the Aga Khan?
Oh no, of course he's met the Aga Khan, but I mean the Aga Khan and the Trudeau family go back to Pierre.
Right.
And so he was a friend of the family. And of course, Justin Trudeau got to enjoy like the Icon's island
Okay,
paradise
but they weren't
estate over
like,
a holiday. But
okay,
I don't think they were doing work, but it was considered a friend thing. But I believe what the ethics commissioner came back with was like the Aga Khan's foundation actually gets government funding. So like it's not appropriate for a head of state to be going
sure.
to a leader's private holiday resort, you know, and then
Well,
also
Ismaili Muslims, it's a little unusual because there are a lot of charitable good works associated with their,
oh no,
yeah, yeah,
this wasn't a mark on the Aga Khan. Nobody
yeah,
questioned the Aga Khan's
yeah.
ethics here.
I don't want us to get canceled. Like, Jen and John start
John,
ragging
John,
on.
I think we've both been canceled. It's too late for that. It's too
Well,
late.
no, but the worm has turned now. Now that we're talking about right-wing wokeness, and like people are getting canceled for not being right-wing enough, which
Yes, well, that pendulum was always inevitably going to swing back, and now it's going to swing back harder
it's
than it
happening
ever.
to me because I'm like
Yeah.
I'm not an anti-vaxxer, and people think I take my marching orders from the pharmaceuticals industry,
I'm
which
sorry, John.
maybe I do, but they make good products. Um, Before you go,
Better living through modern chemistry, man.
and by the way, and after that, we're gonna have some bonus content after the credits roll. We're gonna talk about our 5 favorite prorogations of history.
No,
Just
I was not prepared for that.
number one, Stephen Harper. So the one question I wanted to ask you is the anointed heir of Justin Trudeau, somebody like all his sort of his sort of Brat Pack and a lot of his apparatchiks have kind of glommed onto, is this roguish outsider named Mark Carney. Could you tell the world about how this devil may care political outsider known as Mark Carney? I hear he's a real dark horse. No one's ever heard of him.
Yeah, also probably best known for having run two central banks, which
Right.
is
Two
actually
G7,
two
G7 central bank.
G7
Yeah,
central
yeah, yeah,
banks,
yeah.
which, okay, firstly, I would point out that's actually very impressive as far as
It is,
resumes
and
go.
but the joke here is that he literally called himself an outsider, despite the fact his
Yeah,
signature is on a lot
yeah.
of the bills people carry around in their wallets.
Yeah. Also, I would point out that, I mean, Mark Carney's been an advisor to the government off and on for many, many years in terms of their economic policies, which, I mean, happened to oversee the country becoming overly centralized griftocracy. But that's a
We've
whole
heard your
other.
criticisms, Jen. We've heard your
Well,
criticisms. Yeah, yeah.
I, I'm pissed. What can I tell you?
Are people going to vote for this guy? Like, is he?
I don't know, man.
Uh,
Like, I mean, look, here's what I would say, and this is me borrowing from my husband's deeply autistic polling analysis, is that we're talking about a party that is 20 plus back in the polls and has been for more than a year now, even with a 5 to 7 point jump
right.
with, anyone who's not Justin Trudeau,
Or
and
echoes,
there will be an anyone who's not Justin Trudeau jump.
right?
You're still talking about a thumping goddamn majority for the Conservatives. And Mark Carney's going to come into power. He's going to have weeks, maybe, to put forward a budget that will probably not pass unless he manages to negotiate some kind of deal with the Bloc Québécois or the NDP, which is another intricacy of how Canadians' ridiculous political system works that your Americans don't need to get into it. But there's very good odds that either we're going to be in an election within a few weeks or we're going to be in an election in October. Either way, that's not a lot of time for someone like Mark Carney to define himself with normies.
Right.
And even a 15 point, sort of a 12 to 15 point jump as opposed to a 21 still is a really hard gap. I mean, almost that Mark Carney would have to be a kind of a once in a century kind of leader, and they would have to run a once in a century type of campaign to make up the gap that they are facing right now.
But I mean, it's possible. Carney fever could sweep the nation. Did you
Carney, well,
see that?
he's very charismatic,
Did you see that photo of
as Bank
him?
of Canada governors tend to be.
I think he was at the Calgary Stampede, and he was wearing like an Edmonton Oilers, or these are hockey teams, or Calgary Flames shirt, and he had a beer in his hand,
It was
like
extremely authentic.
holding it like it was photoshopped into it.
Um,
Do you know the photo I'm talking about?
yes, I know exactly the photo with the brand new jersey, squeaky
Yeah.
clean.
I'm gonna I'm
Yeah.
gonna I'm gonna use my my Adobe Premiere skills to put that photo right in the mix as a reward for the people who stuck with this podcast despite the confusing, disjointed, and parochial material that these two Canadians
Hey,
have.
I think I'm bringing it. Okay, I think I think I've been pretty shiny here. I've been carrying this,
You've been
John.
great.
I've
You've
been
been
doing my
great. But
best.
I just realized this is why I don't have Canadian guests, because then it just degenerates into this Canadian
Yeah, it becomes a family dinner is what
right, yes.
happens.
I promise next week we will not be talking about interprovincial trade barriers, but I've broken that promise in the past. So, Jen Gerson, editor of The Line, which you can access at theline.ca.
No, it's www.readtheline.ca. The line.ca was definitely a domain that was taken, so
Okay.
we had to branch out a bit.
I'm so, and by the way, if people go to the line.ca, it's not like some crypto porn site, right? Like it's
Well, I
just
hope not, but I'm
okay.
not promising anything.
Okay. So say, you know what? You
Yeah,
say it.
that's where you get Matt's feedbacks.
Okay. Please say the domain again because the least we can do.
www.readtheline.ca.
Okay. I have it bookmarked, so I don't know what the actual domain name is, but the two principals there, you and we've talked about Matt Gurney, who I work with at the National Post. Matt, if you're watching or listening, we love you. Jen, thanks so much for taking time. I appreciate it.
Anytime. Thank you.
Okay.